Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much to everyone who came today. We're delighted to welcome you to the official launch of the History News Network at GW, an event that we are calling boldly, Why History Always Matters, a sentiment I think we all here can get behind. Today, we are delighted and honored to welcome as our featured guest, Sidney Blumenthal, longtime supporter of HNN. Sidney is a widely published journalist, I'm sure you all know, writing and editing for, among other venues, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, Vanity Fair, GQ, The New Republic, Salon, The Daily Beast, and he's a regular columnist for The Guardian of London. He was executive producer of the Academy and Emmy Award-winning documentary Taxi to the Dark Side about George W. Bush's torture policy, and he has produced a number of other politically and historically informed films. Sidney is the author of 8 books about politics, covering topics from the 1980s to the present, several of which have been New York Times notable books of the year, including The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, The Conservative Ascent to Political Power from 1986, and Pledging Allegiance, The Last Campaign of the Cold War from 1990. He is also the author of an acclaimed multi-volume political life of Abraham Lincoln, which he will be talking about with Kyla today. The first volume, A Self-Made Man, 1809 to 1849, came out in 2016, and the second volume, Wrestling with His Angel, 1849 to 1856, was published in 2017 and was named one of the best books of the year by the LA Times. The third volume, All the Powers of Earth, 1856 to 1860, is due out this fall, and 2 more volumes, evidently, are still to come. We asked him to speak to us today about the relevance of history to today's world of politics. And so without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Kyla Sommers and Sidney Blumenthal. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin, for the kind introduction. Thank you for our audience for coming. I hope you're taking full advantage of the buffet and bar. And most importantly, thank you, Mr. Blumenthal, for generously giving the History News Network your time and your support. You're set to publish the 3rd volume, as Katrin mentioned, of a 5-part Lincoln biography. What made you decide to start writing history after all your political books? And more specifically, why did you choose to write a biography of Lincoln?
Well, first I'd like to say that it's a real pleasure to be here at George Washington University at this event for the History News Network. I was a friend of Rick Schenkman, who was the founding editor of HNN. It is a wonderful site, and I hope everyone here subscribes to it and gets it. Provides real insight into the latest historical thinking and what historians are working on and what they're doing, and I eagerly await my HNN email every week. And I'm delighted that Kyla Sommers has now taken over from Rick, and she has already been doing this for a while, and she's been doing a wonderful job.
Thank you so much.
And I'm especially glad to be here at GW today, whose namesake, Donald Trump, has discussed, or at least there's news about it today. There's a Politico report that he visited Mount Vernon with the French president, Emmanuel Macron, and he learned that George Washington was engaged in real estate, and he believed that Washington had erred in not naming Mount Vernon after himself, as Trump has named everything after himself. And I don't know if he's ever been to George Washington University in the nation's capital, which is named after George Washington. But there are many things named after Washington. So we are surrounded by history here. It's a palimpsest. We walk on ground that that beneath us, especially in our current environment, has deep resonance, and we can always learn on, literally on every single block that we're on, of the past that affects us today. So, to your question. But I did want to say that about HNN. I began work on Lincoln because I fell down a rabbit hole. I had a long journalistic career. I'd worked at the Washington Post, I'd worked at the New Republic, the New Yorker, and other places. And I had worked for a number of years in the White House with President Clinton. And so I served in government. And I wrote a memoir about that. And then I began thinking about presidents and race, a subject that is always with us. And I thought I would write about how the parties had changed identities from Roosevelt to the then present, which was the early 2000s. Lincoln actually talked about this in the late 1850s, given that he was a founder of a new political party, had left the party he had spent all of his life in, the Whig Party, which had ceased to exist, and the Democratic Party was coming apart at the seams. And Lincoln wanted to seize the parts of the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the Democratic Party, particularly the small d Democratic part, for the new Republican Party. And in claiming it, he said that the parties were reminded him, he would always tell a story, reminded him of two men who were late at night, drunk, and fighting in the street, and battled their way into each other's coats. And that's how he described what was going on between the then Democratic and Republican parties. That sort of has happened with our parties. The old Democratic Party that had existed, even in the New Deal, actually split apart. And they had a Dixiecrat wing. They ran an independent third-party campaign in 1948 under Strom Thurmond. And the Republican Party, still, even as late as 1960, under Nixon, got a third of the black vote. So it was a different world. But how did that all change? So the more I began looking into it, the farther I fell into the past, and the deeper I got into history. And the more I learned about the history beneath each president, the more I tended towards Lincoln. And once I landed on Lincoln, I stayed there. And that was enough for me. I had always been fascinated, if not obsessed, with Lincoln as somebody who was a boy who grew up in Illinois. I grew up in Chicago, which is in Illinois, and was taken as a very young boy on a trip to Springfield to see the Lincoln sites. And it made a memorable impression on me, and it stuck with me. And I always had a sense of Lincoln and always studied Lincoln. I had, when I was a boy in my very early teens, it was the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. And it was also the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. So all of that merged in my mind, and I, on my own, would read a lot about the Civil War, and at the same time, in the news, I didn't even have half-hour news shows then on the networks. I had 15-minute shows. The civil rights stuff was happening, and I was really galvanized by that as a boy, and taken with it and associated it with the struggles that had led to and were played out in the Civil War. So it made a big impression on me. And so when I fell back to Lincoln. I just decided to devote myself to it and decided that the questions that were confronting us today all had their roots then, and that rather than writing and spending all my time in contemporary journalism, I could more effectively, over a longer period of time, write on history.
That's fascinating. I think for a lot of Americans, when they picture Lincoln, they picture his stoic figure either on a bill or in, the marble of the Lincoln Memorial. And part of your role as a biographer is to peel back that stoic image and show the humanity behind him. And one of the things that you really chose to focus on in Self-Made Man, the first volume of your 5-part biography, was Lincoln as a politician. And I want to read just a little bit of it to really give a clear picture. Lincoln above politics was not Lincoln. Lincoln did not believe that politicians were unsavory creatures he felt compelled to associate with out of duty. He did not hold himself above the political give and take or dismiss the deal-making or log-rolling, as it was called, as repugnant to his higher calling. He did not see politics as the enemy of his principles or an unpleasant process that might pollute them. These notions were wholly alien to him. He never believed politics corrupted him. He always believed that politics offered the only way to achieve his principles, and he never thought of politics as separate from who he was. He discovered the promise of American life and created the man who became Abraham Lincoln through politics itself. Why was it so important to you to show that political side of Lincoln and really humanize him in that way?
Lincoln, we can talk a long time about Lincoln, but here's one short course, and there are many others. Lincoln is an icon, but he's an icon of democracy. Mm-hmm. He's an icon of saving democracy against a counter-revolution against it. He is an icon in his personally, in rising to the presidency as somebody who came from extreme poverty, who had hardly any education, just a few weeks in what was called a blab school on the frontier, and educated himself. So it was enormously became a very self-disciplined man, and intellectually rigorous in developing his arguments, which became enormously powerful and one of his most important instruments of politics. The man who became his law partner, William Henry Herndon, who was his younger man. Lincoln had a two-man law office. He hired Herndon because he thought he could handle the books, but neither of them could handle the books. And Lincoln's wife hated Herndon, wouldn't have him to the house. But Herndon wrote, some very interesting books about Lincoln. And there's a scene where he says Lincoln, floated down the Sangamon River like driftwood and just landed at New Salem and stuck there. I'm paraphrasing. And when he did, he didn't have a job. He had left his family, had difficult relations with his father. He had virtually no education. He had no calling. He's 21 years old. And he immediately gets a job as an assistant postmaster in town, which is a political job. All the postmasters are political appointees. And within 2 years, he's running for office in town. And he never stops running for office. He is always running for office. And he's trying to figure out how to run for office. When he ended his congressional career, he went into a profound depression that was also accompanied by the death of one of his sons. And he wondered whether he could ever make a mark in the world that mattered. It was one of his deepest depressions, and people called it melancholy then, but we would call it depression. And only gradually does he come out of it and events take over and propel him forward. But Lincoln had become a deeply political person who saw politics as democracy in action. A lot of politics was corrupt. Lincoln was, as his first law partner said, who trained him in log rolling, not corrupt. But he could trade with the best of them in getting bills through the Illinois legislature. And by his late 20s, he's the Whig floor leader of the Illinois legislature. I mean, he is a wunderkind of politics. He has ups and downs, he loses, he learns a lot from defeat. And his view of human nature is deepened constantly by his political life and how his encounters with people. And politics is not separate from that life in those towns. That's how they do their business. Everyone's engaged in it, one way or another. And he wants to be somebody. And that's why he's in politics. And it's a very democratic aspiration on Lincoln's part.
So between the publication of the first volume in May 2016 and then the second in 2018, a lot changed, or at least seemingly changed. And I think the assumptions that we had about the scope and path of politics in May 2016 really changed afterwards. Did that kind of shifting sense of politics change how you approach the second at all, or if it had already been written, the third? Or how did that context shape your thinking about Lincoln?
I think these are really larger, this suggests larger questions about the writing of history for everyone who writes history and looks into it. And one of them is, how is history shaped by the times you're living through? And your own perspectives as you're living through it. There's a historiography to Lincoln. Mm-hmm. There's not just Lincoln, there's Lincoln through the eyes and the writing of people of different times and different periods. People some of whom were politicians themselves, some of whom were just who knew Lincoln, some of whom were generations afterwards, and some of whom knew people who knew Lincoln, and some now who just have to rely on the writings. But in my case, I believe that this current volume, which is being published in September, has been influenced by what's happened since the election of 2016, in a broad sense. In a sense of this volume deals with the period of Lincoln from 1856 to 1860. It's the making of the president, 1860. It's somebody who is an obscure country lawyer who's had one term in the Congress here in Washington. He lived in a boarding house that is now the site of the Library of Congress. It was torn down, but that's where it was. It was right across from the Congress. Lincoln creates the Illinois Republican Party, and he has to create every step of the way, every instrument of political power to get where he is in a time of polarization, division. He has to confront the forces of nativism with a nativist anti-immigrant movement that has a powerful party called the Know Nothings. He has to confront racism, fundamentally, the issue of slavery, its morality, the extension of slavery to the territories, its relationship to the balance of political power in the Congress and the presidency and the federal government and in the country as a whole. And the overarching question of equality that confronts people involving race and slavery, which plays out in his, all through this period, particularly in his great debates with Stephen A. Douglas, who was one of the great demagogues of the age. And the idea that these were, that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were these Socratic dialogues or, uplifting discourses on great philosophical questions to which politicians should aspire, have not read the debates. But Douglas was a vicious racist looking for racial wedge issues at every turn and trying to discredit Lincoln. Douglas was made every argument he could in favor of white supremacy and tried to make Lincoln look like a betrayer of the white race. And that is the essence of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So Lincoln emerges in this period. There is violence, not only in Kansas, bleeding Kansas, where people are killing each other and there's a civil war over whether that territory will be free or slave, but there's violence on the floor of the United States Senate, in which a congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, conspires with a few people who, from his delegation and elsewhere, enraged at the statements of the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, and while he is sitting at his desk at the Senate writing letters, comes up to him with a cane and nearly beats him to death, and blood pours over the floor of the United States Senate. And there's a lot that flows from that blood, that violent incident. And that is the, within 10 days of that, Lincoln presides over the founding convention of the Illinois Republican Party. John Brown commits a massacre of pro-slavery settlers in Kansas in retribution. There's a lot that's set in motion here. So I have certainly been influenced living through a period of nativism, racism, polarization, a house divided, in writing about those very questions in the volume that will soon be published.
So, house divided, there's divisiveness, and I think that's things that we hear a lot in the news today. The idea that, America is polarized, this is a super tense or, especially partisan time. And I think of, I study 1968, and I think back to 1968 and how that time also seemed cataclysmic. And the period that you're writing about, senators are literally getting in fights on the floor, as you mentioned. And, it's not just rhetorically divisive. The country literally divides and goes to war with each other shortly after. So what lesson does that, the idea that there was that much divisiveness to the point of war, or, for 1968, the idea that it was seemed that apocalyptic at the time, what does that tell us today? Does that say that, calm down, it's not that bad? Does it say that we need to take it really seriously, because if we're not careful, it can spiral out of control? What lesson do you take from studying a divisive time?
Well, I was alive in 1968 too, and I remember it very well. I was one of those in the streets in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. I remember when Dr. King was assassinated and the protests that took place at my college and the ceremonies. And I remember politics, the Democratic Party coming apart at the seams, and the rise of Richard Nixon, and pledging to bring the country together, but which he did not. So I think that I think we're in a dangerously divisive period, and that it's if I can make comparisons to what Lincoln encountered and past presidents, it's certainly a different period, and I know there are people here who study Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was a tragic figure. Lyndon Johnson hated the polarization. Lyndon Johnson really did want to bring the country together. He didn't know, he was profoundly aware of how he was trapped in a vice over the issues of Vietnam and racial violence, and how his support for civil rights had also given momentum to racist forces. That's very different from what we're dealing with now. Lincoln rose to power when the president was James Buchanan. And James Buchanan could not have been more different than what I'll call the current occupant. James Buchanan had a long career in public life. He'd been a senator. He'd been the Secretary of State. He liked the title of the old public functionary. But he was a weak man. He was manipulated by others in his cabinet and in the Congress who had agendas to manipulate him. He was a northern man of southern sympathy, which is why he was there. And those who manipulated him had put him there to do that. And when the crisis struck, he was stricken and passive and allowed the country to come apart. But he was he hated the country coming apart. He blamed abolitionists. He blamed the Republican Party then, which was considered to be a radical force. And he did nothing. And he was, in his public demeanor, completely dignified. Even as he was, at least in the record up to the present, the worst president in the United States, among the worst presidents in the United States. But we're in a period where we have a president who actively divides the House, actively feeds off of polarization in the name of the base. All the forces that Lincoln had to contend with are forces that are encouraged by Trump. So, is there a Lincoln out there? I would hazard saying anyone is Lincoln. But Lincoln, had a sense of the magnitude of the task before him, so that as he was writing private letters about it as early as 1855, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, about how it was all coming apart, and making speeches, and in 1858 talking about the House divided and how it would become all one thing or all the other. And that's, if we're following Lincoln's idea here from his House Divided speech of whether the House will become all one thing or all the other, Lincoln says he doesn't expect the House to fall, but it did. It fell into civil war. And so the question is, how does that happen? Does it become all one thing or all the other? What kind of conflict are we headed into? Who incites conflict? What is the nature of the conflict? What dark forces are summoned and manipulated in that conflict? And one of those forces, in my view, is historical ignorance and used as a tool. So I think historical knowledge can be a very important remedy for the forces of ignorance. At least I say that as a kind of bromide.
I think I'll ask just one more question and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Obviously, you spent a decent amount of time working in the White House under Bill Clinton. How did that firsthand experience, dealing with the everyday conflicts and stresses of the presidency, how did that impact how you're examining Lincoln's own presidency?
Well, there's some things about the White House that are similar. Mm-hmm. I mean, the building's there, and the rooms are the same. And I had a great historical interest, and I had the license to roam all over the place. And I there's a White House historical curator. And I befriended her, and there's a White House library, actually, about presidents. And it's a strange building, especially in the basement, because you can see the burn marks from the War of 1812, when the White House was burned. They're still there. And there are hieroglyphics that are engraved into the foundation of the building, made by the masons who built it. The public doesn't see those, but it's one of the things I wanted to see. But what's different is that Lincoln had a White House staff, as far as I can determine, of 3 people. He had 2 principal private secretaries and a secondary private secretary. And he had a cabinet who he would listen to or not listen to, and bring in or not bring in. He had a vice president who he mostly ignored, and the president has different layers of staff today. I wouldn't compare it to what goes on right now, because I think or one hopes, an anomaly. But as I experienced it, and and Republican presidents conducted themselves in the White House previously, there's the White House senior staff, and then their deputies and special assistants and so on, and it's like living on a campus. It's like being on a campus and people. The experience is, it's not quite like West Wing. Nothing quite gets resolved at the end of, the hour. There are a lot of meetings. I have a lot to say about Bill Clinton, who was always at least equal to the best informed person in a room on policy. In almost always, disliked anybody who sucked up. Didn't dislike that. Did not want anyone flattering him at all. wanted people to present hard cases at all times, once admonished me and John Podesta and a number of others for bringing in a bunch of people to discuss policy, but failing to bring in women and people of color into the Oval Office, and told us never to do that again. So it was a different kind of place. So you know what I went through, I learned has great application. I would just say about two things. One, the coming apart of the Western Alliance today, which is you know, a very dangerous matter, seems to be actively promoted. I had the responsibility of building a new international process through the White House of what was called progressive governance. Some people called it the third way. It's different than what people mean by it today. I had known Tony Blair for a long time, before he had become the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, and introduced him to Bill Clinton. And then I was in the middle of that relationship, and the relationship, and what we did was we brought our people in government to London and met with their key people to have very intensive policy discussions. These were very serious discussions about what was possible, the differences, what we could learn from each other, and then we broadened it out. And by the end, I think we had 12 different governments involved in that level of discussion. It all dissipated. It all went away. You know, I think it was one of the highest levels of international cooperation that had been affected. It was after the Cold War, and we had a sense of what was possible. It had an effect on all sorts of things, including multilateral aid programs, dealing with world crises, economic development, the impact of globalization on labor forces, and the growth of ethno-nationalism and those wars in the Balkans, because those were fought out. So to me, that was a very serious matter, and I learned a lot, and I did a lot, and it's a crisis point now. So, and then of course there was the matter of the impeachment, and that refracts today. In many ways, some direct and some ironic.
Well, thank you so much. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Yes, in the back.
Okay, I was going to ask, I remember seeing an interview with Pamela Harriman in about 1998, maybe, so it's a long time ago now, 21 years, where I think it was 60 Minutes, and she was, I think at the time, Bill Clinton's ambassador to France, and they asked her, the interviewer asked her, like, well, what political leader would you compare Bill Clinton to? And she said, Winston Churchill. So my question is, like, we're here in this space, you know, like, is that a comparison? You knew them pretty well, the Clintons. I mean, is that the comparison you would make, or?
Well, I don't recall. I knew Mrs. Harriman. I wasn't not close to her, but I knew her, and um, she was ambassador to France. President Clinton appointed her ambassador to France. She had many ties there. Of course, she had been the daughter-in-law of Winston Churchill, and that's quite a flattering comparison. I wouldn't compare anyone to Winston Churchill, and certainly President Clinton never had the level of crisis that Churchill faced. And in some ways, that's similar to, what I would compare, is President Clinton and Theodore Roosevelt, both of whom could have risen to, great occasions. With great crises. Clinton had a lot of crises that he dealt with, but they were very different than obviously what Churchill faced, which was the entire fate of Western civilization. But if I can point to a couple of things that Clinton faced. One, the bombing in Oklahoma City. There was a terrorist bombing by a domestic terrorist. It was the greatest terrorist incident domestically in the United States. And it was a shock. It had to do with, it occurred at a moment of rising extremist militancy and a good deal of violence in the country. Some of which resonates today. And I think Clinton really rose to the occasion there. And it was an occasion that was, it wasn't being at war, it was in some ways bringing people together. And also warning people about the dangers of extremism. And I'm paraphrasing as I recall what Lincoln said in his, Clinton said in his speech in Oklahoma City was, you can't hate your government and say you love your country. So I think that's a very important thing to say about, and particularly in that moment. So I think that was a very, key moment in the Clinton presidency. If there's another one, it would be during the Kosovo War. Milosevic of Serbia was engaged in ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, and Clinton drew the Allies together through NATO and engaged in a bombing campaign. We didn't put any troops on the ground. There were mistakes made during this. There was an accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. There was a train accidentally bombed. It's what happens in wartime. And there were immense tensions between the French and the U.S. and the Brits wanted to be more militant and pressed for putting troops on the ground early. So there were a lot of, he was in that, at least there, a wartime leader. The Republicans in the Congress refused to support the action, which was extraordinary. And it prevailed after 70-some days. Through a combination of force and diplomacy with the Russians, because the Russians then under Yeltsin withdrew their support of what Milosevic was doing. And then within a year, Milosevic was overthrown in a popular uprising in Serbia. So it was, during that period, Clinton held his nerve and dealt with, had to deal with a lot of, tensions that other wartime leaders had dealt with, different than the dimension of Churchill.
Yeah, thank you. So you've had a really interesting career that has involved journalism, politics, and history. You're working as a historian, a kind of trifecta that I would love to sort of emulate in some ways, but we'll never manage to do. But I want to focus in particular upon the relationship between journalism and history, which is, of course, something that the History News Network attempts to do as well. I'm wondering if you could offer some reflections upon the way in which your work as a journalist might have influenced and shaped your work as a historian, and the way in which history can influence and shape the work of journalists.
That's a really important question, and it's a question that absorbs me. I spent many years, many decades in journalism, and when I wrote history, I didn't cease to become a journalist, but applied the methods I had learned to history. Methods of investigation, of evaluating witnesses, sources, and I hope drilling down to trying to find out what the real story is. So, I try and, as a journalist, dealing only with the past where I can't interview people, which is very frustrating. Reading it all as much as I can and going to the footnotes and then reading that to see if those who are writing have got everything and trying to figure it out myself. So I, in some ways, regard myself as a journalist assigned to the 19th century. I believe that historical consciousness should be integral to journalism today and is urgent given what we're going through, so that we understand what in the past has led to the situation that we're in. That's always the case, no matter what, and it's a pressing case today. Many journalists sometimes rely on data. They retreat into, if I can be critical of journalists, into categories of punditry that have no meaning, well, this field has 3 lanes, that sort of thing. It would be much better if people would read history and reflect on, as it was said, where we've been, that has hadn't caused us to be where we are. So I think the more history, the better. And particularly in journalism, which and here in Washington, which is campaign and politically oriented, it's often obsessed with, it's a cliche, with horse race journalism and increasingly with data. And people, might learn more from the past.
Yes, I'm Christopher Gray. We share a close friend in Alan Gelso, Mr. Blumenthal. I'd like to ask you about 2 U.S. senators with unsavory reputations, one of whom you were just talking about. 2 unknown facts to most people about both of them. Stephen Douglas, unlike Abraham Lincoln, knew the Southern ruling class was not bluffing and would wage civil war. In fact, during the election of 1860, he greatly shortened his life to warn the entire Union. And his friend Lincoln, they were friends, about the Southern ruling class being serious about it. He also passed the Compromise of 1850, which helped
the Union and especially the North grow a lot stronger over 10 years. That's one comment I want to ask you about Douglass there. The other is, how many people know that Joseph Raymond McCarthy was ardently pro-civil rights? And the biographers of both Paul Robeson and Langston Hughes are amazed at how courteous McCarthy was to Eslanda Robeson, Mrs. Paul Robeson, when she came before his subcommittee, and also Langston Hughes, who was not only African American but gay. In fact, at the end of his inquiry with Langston Hughes, Roy Cohn was nasty to both of them, of course. He was what he was. He smiled and winked at Hughes. Hughes was amazed that this is Joe McCarthy smiling and winking at him at the end of the inquiry. Why are those facts not more widely known? Isn't it because journalists are so biased against the two men? Journalists and historians both?
Well, I hope you read my volume 3, which has a lot about Douglass in that period. And the Democratic Party was destroyed in 1860 because elements from the South did not want Douglass to have the nomination. And they preferred to destroy the party, and they had another agenda as well. Some of them were pro-secession, and they were afraid of Douglass, who had a different interpretation about what should be done in the territories than they did, although he supported Dred Scott. He gave up his campaign at the end and went south and tried to rally Unionist sentiment against what he believed was, and he spoke openly about it, as a conspiracy to divide the country. When Lincoln became president, Douglass, who died, shortly afterward, there are accounts of him rushing in and warning Lincoln about the dangers of these people who have done this, and how Lincoln did not appreciate what they were up to, and the nature of the conspiracy, and Douglass always used that word. So I hope that we can discuss Douglass further when my book comes out.
How about Joe McCarthy? We're not going to concede anything to him? Anything good?
Well, Joe McCarthy, was a pretty disreputable character who also, tried to whitewash the Nazis in the Malmedy massacre, of American soldiers. So, it's...
It was more a matter of, there's still...
Sir, if you...
There are other people who had questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about McCarthy.
As a presidential biographer, I'm sure you've used presidential libraries, and I'm just wondering if you're concerned about the shift to digital libraries and potential destruction of records. Are we concerned about that moving forward? Are you concerned about that?
I hope none of the records are destroyed at all. I know that the Obama Library wants to digitize everything and make that available to people, but I hope that they are keeping all the records physically, which are really important. And I don't know if they're just photocopying every page or what, but it's, if they're photocopied, even then, it's important to feel it. But I got a lot of paper when I was working in the White House from all sorts of people, and including from the president, from President Clinton. And he would write lots of stuff and send me stuff that he wrote. And if the handwriting is not included, you're not getting it. You're not getting the historical document. And I don't know. You know, you can photocopy it, maybe, but you need to look at it, in my view. So you ought to have both. That's my feeling.
We'll take two more, right here and then over there.
Thanks a lot for your great comments. Very happy that History News Network is at GW. You mentioned Abraham Lincoln's letters. I wondered if you'd be willing to talk about the similarities and differences, building off the last question, on letters and emails from the perspective of a historian.
Lincoln's papers you can actually read in digitized form at the at the Library of Congress site. You don't have to even travel down there to see them. You can read them in many. Many of them are photocopied. So Lincoln's there's a book called Lincoln's T-Mails. And it's about the telegraph office, which was in the War Department next to the White House. Lincoln spent a lot of time there. There were no emails, but Lincoln, read a lot of telegrams. That was the internet of the day, and that's how he followed the instantaneous progress of the war as it was happening by hanging out in that telegraph office off of Stanton's office in the War Department. It's now where it's called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building is today. It was a different building. Lincoln got telegrams, he sent telegrams, and he dictated letters and received a lot of letters. Some of the most famous letters, one of the most famous letters attributed to him was probably written by his secretary, John Hay, the letter to Mrs. Bixby about the loss of her sons. But doesn't mean that Lincoln did not have that kind of eloquence and touch on his own, as we know. So the letters are incredibly interesting. I'm writing volume 4 now, and I've been reading through I'll give you a small slice, it's history. Lincoln had, before he was president in the transition, after his election, one spy in Charleston, South Carolina, after secession. And that spy was a captain in the very small garrison that was attached to Fort Moultrie that then went to Fort Sumter. And his name was Abner Doubleday. And he wrote letters. He would go around town and collect information and even speak to slaves to try and hear what masters were saying, and write letters to his brother, who was a banker in New York, who would send them to Lincoln in Springfield. And Lincoln read them very closely. And they describe in some detail the decayed state of Fort Moultrie and how it was indefensible, the tenor, the atmosphere in the town, it's pretty. So these letters are available. They're in the Lincoln papers. So there's an enormous amount of illuminating material in these papers, and I know that there would be in other presidents, and particularly subsequent presidents, when there's so much paper.
Right, and the last question over here.
My name is Leon Fink. Mr. Blumenthal, you make very convincing contrasts between both Lincoln's and, for that matter, the Clinton White House and the current setting. But I wonder, from your experience, what lesson do you draw from the arc from the Clinton White House that you experienced and today's politics political culture, given the fact that both Clinton and Tony Blair, who we invoked earlier on the international front, are both sort of effectively denied by their own parties, by their own prior constituencies. Looking back on it, what connection do you see between the Clinton era experience and today's Democratic Party or today's political polarization?
Well, what I see is, I think about this historically. So one way I think about it is that when Bill Clinton was elected, it was a break with a series of Republican presidents, and it was still a Republican era. And he was running against the grain. He was not elected with a popular majority. He had a plurality, and there were 3 candidates in the field. He came in, and we can go through the whole history of it, but the first year was really difficult, even though he had Democratic majorities in the Congress. Just as thinking historically, during the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And the difference politically between what happened with Obama and Franklin Roosevelt to Obama's detriment was that the crash with Roosevelt happened in 1929, years before he was elected. What happened with Obama was, although he was not responsible at all, was that the worst part of the great financial recession took place when he first took office, so that people, rightly or wrongly in my view, associated that period with him, even though it was the Obama policies that over a long period of time dug the country out of it. And that was part of what was then held against the Democrats as a party. And that's just one factor, I think. So I think that there are different reasons why Clinton and Blair are held in some disrepute by their own parties today. We'll see what happens. You know, the thing about history is history's long. And we'll see how they fare. We'll see what Blair's reputation looks like given the outcome of Brexit and the disintegration of the British political parties. And we'll see. You know, his reputation is also affected by Hillary's loss in 2016, of course. And the rise of Trump. We'll see how this goes. But you know, reputation has changed in history. Just ask Ulysses Grant.
So thank you all so much. Thank you to Sidney Blumenthal and to Kyla Sommers for this very nice event, and thank you all for coming. There's plenty of food and drink still to be had. I also want to remind you that if you haven't already signed up for a History News Network, it is free to sign up for the newsletters. You will get them 3 times a week, and you won't be sorry. And I also want to note that you'll see it says HNN Donate Today, and you would think we're now part of GW, so why should I donate to HNN? In fact, we're completely self-funded. Kyla's salary depends on your donations. Feed the poor child. So in any case, I just want to stress that your support for HNN is very important, and I thank you again for a very nice evening.